Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the final days of Jesus. Much of what we're going to be discussing in this series has leaned heavily from a book by the same title, authored by Andreas J. Kostenberger and Justin Taylor. Now, this is a fantastic book, and it's worth your time to purchase and to read, as it's going to go into much greater detail about the topics that we're going to discuss in this series. It's important before we begin also to discuss our other source material for which we're going to be using for the rest of the week to explore the final days of Jesus, the Bible, specifically the four Gospels. These are found at the beginning of the New Testament. We see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they contain eyewitness accounts and firsthand reports of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The Gospels are reliable sources of information for many factors. The first one being that Matthew and John, the authors of the first and fourth Gospels, were members of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Now, John was even part of Jesus' inner circle, and their records are trustworthy because they were on-site eyewitnesses of the accounts detailed in their writing. Now, Mark, the author of the second gospel, the church fathers tell us wrote his gospel in close association with the apostle Peter, which was also one of the 12 disciples, and he was a member of Jesus' inner circle, as well as a prominent spokesman of the 12. Last, we see Luke. Now, he himself was not an eyewitness. However, he sought to conduct a very careful investigation of these events. And in his writing, he even acknowledges his dependence on those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. And you see this in the first chapter, verse 2 of his book. It is in these writings of these qualified authors where we get our source material for as we discuss the final days of Jesus. We hope you enjoy. Hello, and welcome to our Holy Week study, The Final Days of Jesus. So far, we've discussed how Jesus on Sunday proclaimed loud and clear that he was the promised Messiah by fulfilling the prophecy in Zechariah 9:9, where Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey. Jesus has, and he is still winning over the common people by this proclamation. And they seem really eager to see what he's going to do to help them overthrow the oppressive religious and political systems. Jesus then clears the temple, which further upsets the religious leadership of the time and threatens their power over the people. Jesus continues to teach at the temple, and he avoids the traps that the leadership has set for him. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Herodians, the scribes, and the elders of the people have all entered the scene at this time, and they're trying to catch Jesus off guard with questions. And time and time again, Jesus has left them dumbfounded, to the point where they accept the fact that they're never going to be able to trap him and catch him off guard. And they give in to the fact that he's always going to best them. This is going to keep them from having an excuse to arrest him and kill him. The scene in Jerusalem on Wednesday is electric and tense. The common people are enthralled with Jesus' teaching. They've gathered around him. They're watching his actions. They hang on every word he says, and they can't wait to see what he does next. And the religious leadership is angry with him. He's upset the status quo. It's the final days of Jesus. It's Wednesday, April 1st, AD 33. Wednesday passes with a relative quietness. It's a day different than the others. It's a day for plotting behind closed doors of the religious leadership. They want to kill the one who has upended all of Jerusalem during this time. The man named Jesus had to die. So they plotted how to murder him without losing face with the common people. We know that Jesus continues his teaching at the temple during this time. Luke chapter 21, verses 37 through 38 tells us, and every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged at the Mount of Olivet. And early in the morning, all the people came to hear him in the temple. On Wednesday, there aren't really any recorded controversies. It would seem that those who were unhappy with Jesus have realized that confronting him in the temple only made them look like fools. They wouldn't risk any more humiliation in this way. Even though We don't see direct confrontation recorded. Luke does say that the crowds become enthralled with Jesus as they gather around him to hear him teach. His authority and actions and his teachings, they've made him something of a celebrity among the people. Now, this is a striking difference from Jesus' ministry to this point. You see, Jesus was no stranger to large crowds. The very nature of what he had done, these miracles, had drawn crowds over and over and over again over the last 3 years of his ministry. But up to this point, he seemed off-put or offset by crowds, even at one point telling them things that would cause them to lose their infatuation with him and send them away. He never seemed to like the big crowds or the celebrity status that they gave him. But something was different. It's like Jesus is intentionally drawing as much attention to himself as he could, gathering more and more onlookers and followers. At the same time, he was making his enemies more and more angry and determined to see his time of leadership come to an end. This brings us to the other part of our lesson. There was more going on than just Jesus teaching in the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record what was taking place in secret. You see, there was a group of ruling elders in Jerusalem called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin consisted of 71 members that operated to keep civil and religious order. They operated under the Roman rule and authority of the time there in Jerusalem. And the Sanhedrin, because of this Roman rule and authority, they could not condemn anybody to death, but they could try individuals, and they could find them guilty and then send them to the Roman rulers of the time, who would then render a verdict to punish the offenders. This will be important come Friday. To Romans, keeping the civil peace was regarded as the highest necessity. And in order to keep this civil peace, they usually would rule in favor of the Sanhedrin, the ruling order of the time. Some members of the Sanhedrin, they began to meet in seemingly dark corners or alleys to discuss how to kill Jesus. Matthew 26, 3-5 says, "Then the chief priests and the elders of the people, they gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to kill Jesus by stealth. But they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people.'" And something similar is recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verses 1-2. It says, "It was now 2 days before Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And there the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people.'" And lastly, in Luke, in 22, verses 1-2, says, "Now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called the Passover. And the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people." Each of these accounts, they describe treacherous and murderous plotting of the chief priests, scribes, and elders 2 days before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or what we might know as the Passover. Matthew tells us that at least one of these meetings took place in the home of the high priest named Caiaphas. Now, this group of leaders, they were representatives of the Sanhedrin, though it's likely that not all the Sanhedrin was formally gathered together to discuss these things. And see, they were brainstorming ways to kill Jesus without inciting a riot from the people who had come to love him. And they decided that the best way to do this was to wait until after the festival was over. Now, this was a week-long festival that would have ended next Thursday, so this gave them a little over a week to get this done. At that time, when it was over, the crowds of Jewish residents and the multitudes of pilgrims that had come to the city of Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, they would go back home, away from the city. And they felt it would be safe at that point to kill Jesus without fear of the revolt from the people. They were willing to bide their time because they know, or at least they think they know, that they're in positions of power and authority, that if they wait for the right time to dispense with Jesus, they will win in the end. You see, their minds have been made up. They have already tried and convicted Jesus with a verdict of guilty. Now, it's only a matter of time. These are the events on Wednesday, April 1st, AD 33, in the final days of Jesus. Now, before we finish tonight, I want to ask you all to prepare for tomorrow evening to have communion together on our lesson. Tomorrow we're going to cover the events that took place on Thursday, which is when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. I think it's going to be a special time of remembrance. So find some juice or wine or some other sort of liquid and bread and crackers that you might have around the house, and have them ready tomorrow evening as we take a look at what happened on Thursday evening in the final days of Jesus. Now, I also want to let you know that the next couple of days, as we look into what happens on Thursday night and especially on Friday, these are going to take a lot longer to discuss and dive deep into. So be prepared to spend a little bit more time together as we look into these events tomorrow night. So we're going to see you tomorrow night at 8 p.m. on our Facebook or our YouTube channel as we look together at the final days of Jesus.